Hello and welcome back. All right, this is going to be lecture three. Again, we're still on Robert Dahl's book on democracy, and we're skipping to chapter 8. What political institutions does large scale democracy require? So we're sort of skipping from that associational low level that we talked about in chapter 4, and we're jumping up to the aggregated state level. Okay, section 1, the introduction. It is important to know that institutions are not instant. They take a long time to become tradition and culture and to be settled, right? Um, they can be very contentious at first. If you look at Eastern Europe after the wall fell in 1989, all of those states tried to put in democratic institutions, right? But, 20, 30 years down the road, it hasn't been a great experiment. Many of those states have slipped back toward competitive authoritarianism or just straight up authoritarianism. So if you look at Georgia, um, Ukraine, I wouldn't call it the most democratic state. Um, these things take a very long time to settle. If you look at Iraq, post Iraq War, when Larry Diamond, who we'll read later, helped build their constitution, it was a fucking mess. And it ended up in sectarian violence and revolution. And um, the building institutions is a very, very difficult task. You could probably point to Africa as well, post colonialism. Once they set up independent states, it's not like that project has gone well for most of them. Latin America, between the 1960s and the 1990s, just had these constant back and forth between democratic systems and military juntas, back to democratic, back to military juntas. And so this is a difficult task, right? And many of these states have taken a step backward. If we're talking about Latin America, Venezuela was the shining star of South America during the 1990s. It has since collapsed under Hugo Chavez and later Nicolas Maduro, who I guess was arrested last year or extradited to the United States, kidnapped. I don't know what word to use. You have Argentina, who is currently under Milei, and I'd still say it's democratic. I don't think, but they're having some slippage, right? There were questions under Jair Bolsonaro, who was recently given 35 years in prison. He was the Brazilian president before Lula da Silva, who is their president now. Um, he was imprisoned for trying to commit a coup against his own government. Um, you've got Guatemala, which is a bit of a nightmare, and now just last week in Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega said we are never going to have elections again. Right, like we are getting some deep, deep slippage back towards authoritarianism across the planet, but Latin America, I think, is a really good example. Okay, section 2. How can we know whether a state qualifies, right? So, ways of determining whether a state qualifies as a democracy. Number one, historical changes in ways that we can think about whether a state is a democracy, right? Ways that we can conceptualize this. The first is just studying historical changes and seeing if institutions have shifted or changed as a response to, quote, demands for broader popular inclusion, which generally means democracy, right? Like the more you're letting in the middle and the lower classes, the more democratic your state probably looks. Number two, consensus, right? We can ask the citizens of the country, how do you feel? Are you a democracy? We can go to journalists and scholars and ask them about, let's rank these. You can use a multitude of data sets which actually use scholars and journalists. And there are a number of data sets that sort of measure whether and how much a country is democratic. And so some data sets you should know the name of are Polity, the VDEM project, the Varieties of Democracy, the World Freedom Index, and then Jaworski, Lemongi, Cheboub, and Alvarez have their own data set that is a binary, right? And so those are the guys I was talking about earlier in one of the last chapters, where they do not classify the United States as a democracy until 1965. They do not classify Japan as a democracy until around 2000. And then Mexico as a democracy until the early 2000s. And so it just sort of depends on how you measure it. But Jaworski's is really a severe measurement. It is dichotomous. It's either you're a democracy or you're not. Many of the other ones are a little more squishy, like Freedom House and stuff. They have a whole bunch of indicators and they have like this additive index and blah, 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 right? And so it's free or partly free or not free, once they index everything. But Jaworski and Lamongi is like, it's a one or a zero. You're a democracy or you're not. Get over it. So it's an interesting approach. Okay. The third way we could think about it is just like sort of what are the philosophical requirements? So, like, that's what we talked about in the last chapter. What are the philosophical requirements of a democracy, and do these states fit in philosophically, right? Okay. What are Dahl's minimum requirements for a democratic country? He breaks out six. He says, number one, you have to have elected officials. I actually disagree with this, right? Because Athens was a democracy. They didn't really have elections. Again, some democratic theorists are saying we should go back to sort of random lots or straws or whatever you might want to call it, where just any average citizen can randomly be chosen to be a policymaker, right? And so I I kind of don't think that this should be on there as a requirement of a democracy. You could have democracy without elections. I know that's weird to hear because I know that like the whole world, if they're democracies, and even non-democracies like Russia, China, North Korea have elections. So, I'm not sure if this one fits. However, I would say like direct democracy is hard, right? Just having every citizen vote on every single policy would almost just be impossible. It would be expensive. Um, the costs would be wild. The input would be really difficult. And there are just topics that citizens can't vote on. They can't even know about, like nuclear technology. Where are our submarines in the world? How are our spies collecting data from the Kremlin? Um, you can't get the every single citizen in America to vote on these things because we would have no secrecy. Like I get the government needs to be open, but some things are just off the table. It feels like. Okay. The second minimal requirement for a democratic country is free, fair, and frequent elections. Now, this brings up some questions, right? Like, what is free and fair? How frequent, right? And he says, we probably shouldn't have an election every year, and we probably shouldn't have one every 20 years, right? But it's really hard to like pin down an ideal number, right? And so in America, we have a 4-year rolling set, right? And really, it's 2 years. Every 2 years, the House is upended. All 435 members are up for election. Every 2 years, one third of the Senate is upended and has to go through an election. So either 33 or 34 candidates. And then which third segment gets switched every 2 years. So there's never total turnover in the Senate. And then, of course, every 4 years we vote for our governors and president, etc. It doesn't work this way in a lot of democracies. In parliamentary democracies, which we'll talk about later in the course, of course, in parliamentary democracies, you vote for your representative, they go to the parliament, and they choose the prime minister. You actually, as a citizen, do not get a choice of who your actual leader is. The prime minister, who is like the chief executive, the head of state, right? And if the prime minister in the parliament cannot keep their coalition government together, they can call for a vote of no confidence. And if your prime minister cannot pass the vote of no confidence, they scrap the parliament and they hold elections again, right? But this can be really difficult, especially in places like France, not France, Italy, where I mean, for a while, and I think Japan's a little bit like this too, where it seems like every 6 months to a year there's a vote of no confidence, and so there is no stability in their parliamentary body, which can also become very difficult. Now, if the prime minister can hold their coalition together, and votes of no confidence don't overturn their government, then they do have a scheduled election. And oftentimes they can even call early elections. They can say, we think we'll win at this exact moment because we're sort of popular. We're not actually going to wait the whole 4 year term. We're going to call it at 3 years because we think we'll just reset the clock, right? So there's a lot of intricacies going on there. But the real question was, how frequent should your elections be? Um, in my opinion, the House every other year is probably too much, especially given how much they have to like drum up donations and all that stuff. Like they're not spending their time on legislation. But this one's up for debate. Okay. The third minimal requirement for a democratic country is free expression. Citizens have a right to express themselves without danger of severe punishment on political matters, including criticism of officials, the government, the regime, the socioeconomic order, and the prevailing ideology, right? Like even if your opinions are not the culture's opinions, the idea is that this strengthens us as a culture, right? And you don't get the dictator's dilemma. Instead, you're getting true information about criticism. And that can actually strengthen your country, its politics, its economics. Whereas dictatorships, no one speaks the truth. So the dictator has no idea what the reality is on the ground. People are feeding him bullshit all the time. And so things can become cripplingly disastrous like that. I mean, just it can just really snowball because you don't understand the reality of how your citizens feel about you or your government or your policy or your regime or whatever, right? Okay, the US has not always done well with this. If we think about sort of the abolition movement and slavery, there were, I mean, even Abraham Lincoln arrested people for speaking out against the North and abolitionists, right? He sort of cut, what was it called? Your due process and what is called the habeas corpus, right? Produce the body. He got rid of those things. Those are sort of really strong American rights that say the state has to bring evidence against you before they can put you in prison. He got rid of that. And he just said, like, if you're talking out against abolition or against the union, I'm going to throw you in jail and you have no recourse, right? And so on both sides, this was a major problem. You could look at Vietnam, right? There were a lot of criticisms from the citizenry, but there was some pretty severe pushback if you think about like the students killed at Kent State and others. And then the McCarthy period, where we're ruining people's lives over the Red Scare and communism, etc. Um, so America hasn't always done well with sort of free expression, but I would say we tend to do better than the average, especially in modern times. America was founded on this idea of free expression. Most of our founders were deep critics of the British government and were newspapermen. And so, like, they were deeply convinced that we have to have free expression and the right to criticize as a foundational American right, and it will make us stronger in the long run. Okay. Okay, 4, 5, and 6. I don't really have any notes on them. The fourth criteria is alternative sources of information, right? So this kind of touches on like free expression and what I was saying earlier about, our founders being newspapermen. The fifth is associational autonomy. So this just means like freedom of association. You can go and talk to like-minded people, even if they're communists, so long as you're not like plotting a coup or violence against someone. That is a criminal act, right? That's RICO, that's mob stuff. But so long as you're just having a discussion, even if it's not like culturally palatable, you have every right to do that. And the final one is inclusive citizenship, where all citizens carry the same rights, whether regardless of gender or religion or race or whatever. Okay, section 3, the political institutions in perspective. Um, Dahl points out that it is remarkably rare for all of these to exist at once, especially early on in a country's transition. We talked about how hard it is to solidify institutions in the last chapter, and this touches on that idea. It is really rare for all of those 6 things: elections, free and fair elections and frequent elections, free expression, alternative sources of information, associational autonomy, and inclusive citizenship. America had very few of those to begin with, right? And some of them are under attack even in contemporary periods. But most most states just don't have all of these things, right? These are ideals. Again, it's hard to reach ideals, um, and you just strive to be better, right? Let's see. Full suffrage is rather new. We've pointed that out a few times before. Again, Switzerland didn't even let women vote until 1972. Arguably, America didn't let blacks vote until 1965. And so full suffrage is a pretty new phenomenon, especially in human history, right? What we are seeing a lot of is what's called competitive authoritarianism. So this is the idea that your state has elections, but they're bullshit, right? So like North Korea and China and Russia have elections, they're complete bullshit. Um, but they've learned that like they can use the quote unquote legitimacy from the international scene. It's easier to be a dictator with elections than a dictator without, even if you rig the elections, right? Like it offers you some domestic and some international legitimacy that simply being a dictator doesn't offer. And so elections are they're across the planet. Almost every country in the world has elections, but nowhere near every country in the world is a democracy, right? So keep that in mind. Elections don't mean you're a democracy. Let's see, there are some similarities that he points out in what they call the sort of legacy democracies. This would be the Euro crowd and in America. Um, you have elections to some sort of legislative body, regardless of whether it's parliament or Congress or whatever. You have a gradual expansion of suffrage, right? It started at about 2 to 5% of men, and now it's 98% of the population. As long as you're not a child or mentally incapable or a felon in some states, even though even that's sort of being rolled back a little bit, where felons are being sort of given their voting rights back in some states. Let's see. The third similarity to legacy democracies is that there's usually greater expressive rights over time. The United States was a bit of an outlier because, like, we started out with full-throated anger at the government who was running us at the time, Britain, right? And our leaders, again, were newspapermen. They believed in criticism. They thought it made you stronger. They believed in an enlightened citizenry, right? And so America was sort of, I don't know, we were a little bit privileged in that sense because not all countries started out that way by any means, right? Okay, fourth, there's generally some split from factionalism, like chaotic, every man for himself representation, to some semblance of a party congregation, right? And if you look at Federalist number 10 that Madison wrote, they shit all over this idea of factionalism and political parties. They say, it basically destroys and degrades the incentives for trying to improve your citizens and your country as a whole, and instead you're incentivized to only care about your political party and your reelection to the party, right? Um, the problem is like it's inevitable. Even the people like Madison and Jefferson who were railing against party systems in Federalist Number 10 eventually created the world's first electoral party, the Democratic Republicans, as an opposition to Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, who was president at the time. Alexander Hamilton missed his shot. And so, you know, it's nearly inevitable. And even these power brokers who said this is disgusting and we should never have this, sort of folded to like the reality and the logic of winning elections, right? Okay, that's all I've got for you. I have to go teach another class right now, and so I will try to have the final lecture up either tonight, but it'll probably be tomorrow because I got to pick up my kid and get her fed and all that kind of stuff too. So, thank you so much for being here. I look forward to the next one. Have a great day.